Good evening, everyone. This is Kevin Haroff. I am, for now, the current mayor of the city of Larkspur, and I want to welcome everyone to a regular meeting of the Larkspur City Council for today, Wednesday, December 1st, 2021. We're starting at about 6:34 after taking care of a couple of preliminary matters. As is our habit for the last who knows how long, tonight's meeting will be conducted by video conference only. On the agenda, there's a link where members of the public can join the Zoom site and participate in the meeting in that fashion. So we obviously welcome all members of the public who have an interest in participating to please do that. And with that, we'll get started with the meeting. And start with a roll call and pledge of allegiance.
Councilmember Candell.
I am here.
Councilmember Paulson.
Here.
Councilmember Waive.
Here.
Vice Mayor Hilmer.
Here.
Mayor Hara.
Yeah, and I'm here as well. So let's, now that I see the flag is waving, let's do the Pledge of Allegiance as is our habit at these meetings. So I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, with liberty, justice for all. I think I screwed that up. I haven't memorized it yet. 67 years old and I still haven't memorized the Pledge of Allegiance. Anyway, there we go. Let's move on to public comment. Item number 2. This is for members of the public to address items that are not on the agenda or that are part of the consent calendar. If there are any members of the public who would like to speak at this time on those matters, please state your name and where you live, and we will give you 3 minutes to speak, 5 minutes if you are representing a group. So with that, I will allow Allison to see if there's anyone in the public who would like to take advantage of this opportunity.
I'll note that the council received an emailed public comment prior to the meeting that's available on the packet. And I'm looking for any further raised hands or emailed public comment. And we'll hear from Chris Wheaton.
Yeah, Chris Wheaton. I live in the Rose Lane subdivision, and I've been following up for several months now just to have the fence that is in the area that the City Hall Library may go into. That fence has not been maintained. It needs painting, and there's a broken piece of the fence that's there that was reported a couple weeks ago, and just hoping that someone could step up efforts there for that maintenance to be done.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Anyone else in line?
I'm looking for any additional raised hands or emailed comments. And there is no further public comment.
Okay, well, with that, we will close the public comment agenda item for tonight. Move on to item number 3, presentations and proclamations. There are none. So we'll go to the consent calendar. There are 3 items on the consent calendar tonight. And I'll ask first if any council member would like to pull any one of those items for separate consideration. Seeing no one requesting that, let's see if there's anyone in the public who would like to request separate consideration of any of these items.
I'm looking for any raised hands from our audience members or emailed comments. And there is no public comment.
Okay, well, in that case, I'll ask for a motion to approve the consent calendar.
Hilmer moves.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Let's do the roll call for approval.
Councilmember Candell.
Yes.
Councilmember Paulson.
Yes.
Councilmember Waive.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Hilmer.
Aye.
Mayor Hara.
Yes. So the motion is approved, and we have a consent calendar on the books. So we'll move on to the next item, which is the city manager's oral report. Dan Schwartz, it's your turn. Dan's muted.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. I actually have one item, which is to do an introduction. As the council knows, we're very sad to say that our planning and building director, Neil Toff, is retiring at the end of the month after a long and stellar career in Larkspur. And while we're sad, we're also excited for him to get to go do more fun things and relax a little bit. We continue to look for a long-term replacement for our community development department, but in the meantime, what we've done is reach out to a firm that supports us in planning and building, Four Leaf, and we've invited Dan Hortert, which I've asked to come and just introduce himself. Dan is going to serve as a consulting or contract planning manager, but he started today so that he could spend the next few weeks with Neil to pick his brain and have some of that institutional memory that Neil's got transferred. So Dan, I thought if you could just take a minute or two to introduce yourself to the council and the community, I'd really appreciate it.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council. My name is Daniel Hortert. I'm with Four Leaf Inc. I've been there approximately 3 years. I started as planning director of planning with their to start their planning vertical in 2019. I've worked in various municipalities, and we oversee contracts for planning assignments throughout California. And that's about it. I look forward to working with you all, and I'm excited to start this and continue what's going on there, and that.
And I think Dan will be a familiar face for a while. As the council knows, some of our other planning staff are not far from considering retirement. So when we finally find that right fit to be Neil's successor, I think Dan will probably still be around for quite a while after that to help us through this period as we restore our staffing. And this is a pitch. Anybody out there who's got the credentials, let us know. We're like every other employer right now. We're looking for qualified talent in a very tough labor market. So thanks, Dan, for stopping in. I think Dan's going to watch tonight, get a flavor for the planning issue that we have on the agenda. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. City Manager Dan Schwartz. We now have 3 Dans who will be on these calls going forward into the future. So I'm not sure how we're going to keep you all straight.
I think that when I was in kindergarten, I had to be called Danny to resolve that issue because I didn't get to be Dan or Daniel. So,
okay.
But please don't call me Danny now.
I was going to say we could revive that if you'd like. You may not want to do that. So if that's it for this City Manager's oral report, we'll move on to council members' oral reports, and I'll invite any members of the council to talk about what they've been up to since our last council meeting. Anyone have a report to make? Councilmember Waive, please.
Sure. Scott, if you don't mind, I'll jump in and tell about our first meeting today with the with the Community Advisory Committee for the 1241 South Alicio Home Key property. So that was today, the first one of the Advisory Committee of community members. We met online from 12 to 1:30. I think we had a pretty robust discussion. I was also pleased to see that we had Chief Mike Norton has joined that committee to provide some insight as to issues of community safety that seem to be raised by neighborhoods. So we also had a person representing the Kentfield School District, some members of the community who live nearby, who own properties nearby, and we've already started creating a subcommittee which will look at better communications and outreach to the neighborhood. So that will all be available online for people to see, and look forward to this process moving forward. Second thing is the only thing I just want to report. I went to Perry's tree lighting ceremony about an hour ago, and our Central Marin Fire Department was there with a rig and a lot of our officers, also from Kentfield, and really appreciate how Perry Butler puts together a community party like that, and also very supportive of our fire professionals raising funds and items for children during the holiday season. So thank you, Perry Butler, for being such a great community member.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. I think I saw Dan Helmer's hand up a moment ago.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to put a placeholder in the queue for the public to keep alert for meetings that will be scheduled to start to discuss the 101-580 connector project at the Transportation Authority of Marin. Larkspur has been asked to prepare what are called guiding principles for how they would view the benefits of a 101-580 connector project, including consideration of the workforce that is imported and exported into and out of the county during the day, which is a major contributor to the congestion that we see on 101 during peak periods of the day, morning, and late afternoon. So it's a very important project. We have a lot of interest in removing regional trips from Sir Francis Drake, which are now using that street as a connector to the freeway. And as we all know, surface streets don't work very well as freeway connectors. And after all, it is the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, not the Richmond-Larkspur Bridge. So we look forward to those discussions, and also would invite the public to take part in this important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for that report and a reminder of this process going forward. I've been participating in some of the meetings with Tam as well. It's an interesting and convoluted process, and I'm glad you're taking a leading role in moving forward with setting out some of the guiding principles that will allow that project to be a success in the long term. Anyone else from the council? Gabe, your hand's up.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I just had a couple of public safety or some of the fire and flooding items to report. So the Marin Wildfire Prevention Agency, or Measure C JPA, announced some of their deliverables at the end of this year, 2021, and we're trying to develop metrics, but some of these numbers may be helpful for the public, concerned about the fire season and what's coming up next year. So about 12 miles of fire roads were cleared, about 260 miles of roadside evacuation routes, and 327 acres of shaded fuel breaks. So those numbers may not mean something, but in perspective, we really feel that in 2022 we have to do a lot more. That was a significant amount of work, but part of the issue is building out the organization. So currently during the winter season, the staff is really looking at how to hire and whom to hire and so forth. So really we have some time, but we're feeling a sense of urgency around fire. And the other seasonal thing that happens, of course, is flooding. And I attended the Cal League today. And one of the issues that I invite all the other 4 council members to think about is some of the funding that's been made available. So Senate Bill 1, Atkins Bill, calls for regional collaboration. That's one of the main climate resilience sea level rise bills that passed. And there's about about $819 million of funding available. And I'm thinking that I might reach out to Pat Eklund, who's an alternate at the BCDC, the Bay side of the sea level rise, and see what we can do for Larkspur, and see if there's any connection to our unfunded liabilities like the storm drains or anything like that, because there is money. We have a lot of needs. Flooding is one of those boil the frog issues. Nobody thinks about it until there's a king tide or stormwaters, but it looks like this is what fire was 15 years ago. Nobody really thought about the fact that the fires, the forests were getting dry, and now we're in a crisis state. So I'm hoping we take an early lead in trying to manage sea level rise, flooding, and any water issues, particularly in the winter. So I hope to revisit the issue and maybe we can agendize something in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gabe. Anything else from the council? I just have a couple of items real quick I want to mention. At our last council meeting, I think I reported out on a meeting of the executive committee of the MCE board, which recommended a modest increase in overall rates charged by MCE for electricity service within its service territory. On November 18th, full board met and after some robust discussion approved that recommendation to have again, a modest increase in electricity rates across the jurisdiction of MCE. And still, and the good news is that the rates MCE will be charging going forward into the future will remain below what we anticipate from PG&E. So MCE rates remain a bargain. Yesterday, I attended our Larkspur Chamber of Commerce monthly meeting, and I'm glad to report that the finances for the chamber will finish out the year in the black, which is great given the challenging year that the business community here in Larkspur had given COVID. The next year should be an exciting year, we hope, for activities with the chamber. A series of mixers will be planned for members, a bigger and better wine stroll later in the fall. The wine stroll this past year was a great success, and we're going to build on that. And we're going through an initial planning for a fun run to celebrate the Larkspur Loop, which I think we've reported on before. This will be modeled after the old Pacific Sun run that was held every year on Memorial Day. So for those of you out in the audience who are runners and remember that old race, we're going to try to get that going again in a reincarnated form. So be prepared to volunteer and participate. And then finally, the last item that we discussed of relevance to us is that, speaking of tree lightings, we will have a tree lighting at Bon Air Shopping Center tomorrow night. And I have been assigned the responsibility of plugging in the tree, which I have done in the past. And I have been assured by the management of Bon Air Shopping Center that I will be properly grounded to the nearest storm grate and not get electrocuted in the process. And that is my report. So I think we'll close our agenda item number 6, council members' oral reports, and move on to public hearings. We have 2 matters on the agenda for that tonight. The first one is item number 7.1, Marin Sanitary service rates for garbage and recycling collection. And I think we're here to have a presentation tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. Annually, the council considers rates proposed for solid waste service, garbage service from Marin Sanitary, our franchisor for solid waste. And Larkspur is one of a number of Marin Sanitary customers that collectively retain a consultant to help analyze those rates, make sure they're appropriate. We currently have a contract with R3, and tonight with us from R3 is Garth Schultz, who's going to take us through a presentation about the rate study for this year and the proposed rates. So I'm going to turn it over to Garth.
Great. Welcome, Garth.
Thank you, Honorable Mayor, Vice Mayor, City Council members, staff, and members of the public. I'm Garth Schultz. I'm principal consultant with R3 Consulting Group, and I've been before many of you before, but just by way of introduction, we're a boutique consulting company that works exclusively for local agencies, cities, towns, special districts, and counties on matters relating to waste and recycling, contracts, rate setting, finance, policy, and state compliance. I will share my screen this evening. I have a brief presentation just outlining kind of the main salient points regarding the recommended rate adjustment to MSS's 2022 rates, and then happy to take any questions that you might have. Okay, should be up there now. Can I get a thumbs up from someone? Just let me know. Yes. We're good.
You're
Thank
good.
you so much. Excellent. Alrighty. So as city or the town manager, city manager prefaced, we do this review on behalf of the 7 franchising agencies that have a franchise agreement with Marin Sanitary Service. And so it's one consolidated and cost-effective review providing results and outcomes for the 7 agencies in mass. But this presentation is specific to your outcomes and the rate adjustments for Larkspur. So this is what I'll cover during the brief presentation. As you may recall, and is highlighted in your staff report, there was a new rate adjustment methodology adopted by the council in 2019 that sought to streamline and simplify and make transparent and predictable rate adjustments. That was after a couple of years of development, moving away from a prior essentially cost plus based agreement into something that has a more truer indexed set of rate adjustments. And via that methodology, which is adopted as an exhibit to your franchise agreement with Marin Sanitary Service, you essentially have an indexed rate adjustment methodology that continues until such time as either you or MSS call for a more detailed cost-based review. And this is, I believe, the 3rd or 4th year that this index has been in place under this new process. So broadly speaking, and I'll cover these 5 main categories shown on the slide, the index rate adjustment is mostly tied to an external Bureau of Labor Statistics market index. And that is for the primary activity that MSS provides, which is the collection operations, the collection of garbage, green waste, and recycling from residents and businesses and industrial customers in the community. For Larkspur, that's around 62% of the overall rate revenues is for that set of activities, and that is adjusted not based on actual costs, but based on this external Bureau of Labor Statistics index. It's essentially a CPI for water, sewer, and trash utilities. It's publicly posted online. So most of the rate, nearly 2/3 of the rate, is adjusted via that index. The other primary components of the rate adjustment involve post-collection activities, and these are the processing of recyclables and organics for recycling sales into the global marketplace, or composting of organics, or landfilling of the resultant and remaining residual garbage. Those costs are pegged to 2 separate factors. One, of course, the number of tons of those items that are generated within Larkspur on an annual basis, and then the per ton tipping fee for those. And I'll go into more details on that in the next slide. But that's roughly 11% of the overall rate revenues are for those post-collection activities. The final 3 categories, there is a new set of activities, which the council, I'm sure, will be hearing more about in coming council meetings, and perhaps you've been briefed on, relating to new state laws pertaining to reduction in landfilling of organic waste. That's around just about 1% of rate revenues. Those are negotiated and adjusted essentially based on proposed needs, either by MSS or certainly by Larkspur itself. 4th category that is part of the annual indexed rate adjustment process is a calculation of revenue for MSS's operating profit. Approximately 7.5% is shown here. And that is essentially tied to what else is going on with the collection operations or the pass-through. So it's a ratio based on the calculated revenue need. It's important to understand this isn't a guarantee. It's a part of the way this rate methodology sets rates to allow for a reasonable operating profit. But whether MSS achieves that profit is really dependent on whether it keeps expenses within the allowable revenues that you're providing via the rate setting process. If expenses are above revenues, well, then they have lesser profit. So it isn't a guaranteed profit. And then finally, there's a government fee comportion for franchise fees, vehicle impact fees, and fees for the Joint Powers Authority Zero Waste Marin, which is approximately 20% of the rate. So these are, essentially adjusted in fairly simple and straightforward process via this annual index rate adjustment activity. I'll go into some more detail now about what's going on with each of these categories this year. For that big bucket portion of the rate, that 60% that is MSS operations, the resultant index adjustment for that is a 3.57% increase, again, tied directly to that Bureau of Labor Statistics index. Post-collection, landfilling, and organics, as well as the recycling, both of those bullets are here. For garbage and organics, the tipping fee itself is also adjusted by the same index, but tons in the most recent 12 months are down compared to the recent 12 months in the prior year. So the resultant decrease to this item is around 6%. So it's a savings to the ratepayer as a result of decreasing tonnage, which by all accounts is essentially an outcome of the COVID pandemic and reduced tonnage in the commercial sector. So this perhaps may rebound in future years with future economic and business recovery, but it is a reduction overall to the needed revenue and rate increase for this year. Similar good news on the recycling tipping fee front. As many of you will recall, several years ago with the onset of the Chinese national storage policy, there was a dramatic reduction in the amounts of revenues achieved by the sale of recyclables in the global marketplace, prompting an increase in the cost of processing those materials. This year, that's a recovery effort. So there's recovered revenues for things like paper and cardboard, meaning that the overall per ton tipping fee for recycling through your agreement reduced by 45% compared to the prior year. So another significant savings to the ratepayer. This is a success story in terms of this rate adjustment methodology, as City Manager Dan Schwartz will recall. It was very important when we were adopting this methodology for the franchisors that the franchising agencies and their ratepayers would share both in the successes and costs related to recycling markets. And so as recycling markets are rebounding, the credit and the benefit is going to the ratepayer. The final three categories, there is a small amount of additional revenues being pegged for the state compliance, primarily around the new state law, SB 1383. MSS is adding a new organics route throughout the 7 service areas. So it's not one just for the city of Larkspur. It is one that's across the whole 7 areas, as well as one additional outreach and education specialist. They also maintain a tracking database, which is really important in terms of recording information that's reported to the state pursuant to these state laws. And then there's some revenue share for state compliance consulting support. So these are the types of activities that are being shared across all 7 of the franchisors. MSS's operating profit essentially just floats with what else is happening to the other categories above. For this rate year, the operating profit for the Larkspur ratepayers is at just under a 3% increase. And then finally, on the government fee component, zero waste Marin fees carried in the rates are down nearly 10% compared to last year. This is a result of actually a true up that was included in last year's rates because of a snafu on some of the ways that was calculated in years prior to that. So it's now being essentially set to actual, but it is a benefit to the ratepayer for this year. And then finally, your city franchise fees are increasing by 0.73%, which is the exact amount by which the rates are going up this year. So your franchise fee is set as a percentage of overall rate revenues. And so therefore, when rate revenues increase, so does the franchise fee. So those are the primary factors. There are more detailed factors included in our report. There are a few other benefits also this year, reductions in needed rate revenues for 2022. One primary category is the sunsetting of true-ups that were included in the older rate methodology. These were for things like fuel and oil, truing up disposal costs on a year-to-year basis. And there was also a deficit in recycling revenues that was spread out over time. Those are all sunsetting for 2022, and it's a net effect of a 0.5% kind of reduction or credit to the ratepayers, offsetting other costs. Another category that is a benefit to the ratepayer for this year is essentially a waiver of a balancing account. So in the rate methodology, it's held in the agreement, if MSS under or over collects revenue compared to the annual revenue requirement, well, that amount flows through to the benefit or debit of future rate years. Now, in 2020, of course, COVID-19 hit. That resulted in a reduced garbage subscriptions, and primarily in the commercial sector, which resulted in lower than anticipated collected revenues in the commercial sector. But MSS also received a PPP loan, which they expect to be forgiven, thereby offsetting that revenue shortfall. So they have waived their request, or waived what they could request as a balancing account reconciliation for this year because of that anticipated forgiveness of the PPP loan. And then finally, this is a small thing, but there are these little add-ons periodically from time to time, kind of extraordinary items. In the recycling industry, property insurance for recycling collection facilities is dramatically increased over the last several years, primarily due to fires that occur in material recovery facilities throughout the country. It has become increasingly difficult to ensure recycling processing operations. However, in this year, MSS is actually seeing a reduction in their premium compared to prior years. So also a credit to the ratepayer. So nearly, close to 1% in all in terms of benefits to ratepayer this year. So the overall net impact for the city of Larkspur and its ratepayers is 0.73% increase in rates effective January 1. You can see here what that means for your most common residential ratepayer and an example commercial ratepayer. So it's 37 cents a month for your most frequently subscribed to 32-gallon garbage service for residents, and then under $5 a month for any commercial business that's subscribing to 3 cubic yards of garbage once per week. Finally, everyone always wants to know where they stand in terms of the playing field. So the average rate for 32-gallon residential rates amongst those entities shown here on this chart is just over $51 a month. You are just 7 cents above that average. And so I'll say it's just spot on with the average. You're right in the middle of the pack, and right in the middle of the pack for essentially, top-notch service. Frankly, no real reason for concern as far as I see it. So with that, I will close my portion of the presentation. Very happy to take any questions that you have, and then support the council as you move into rate hearing and likely adoption. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Garth. Appreciate that. Very thorough report as always. Let me open it up to the council if there are any questions from members of the council on the report that we've just heard. Catherine, I see your hand up.
I think I saw Vice Mayor Dan Hilmer first, so I'll go after him.
Okay, Vice Mayor Hilmer, I didn't see you. You were obscured on my screen, so please go ahead.
Hi, I don't have a question. I have a comment. That was a great presentation. I have been with this as long as Dan Schwartz. In fact, I attended the meetings with him at the initial unveiling of the methodology and proposal. And I really appreciate the clear narrative that the consultant laid out. It was very consistent with my recollection of how we got to where we are today. And I just want to compliment him on the content and the way in which he made it easy to understand.
Thanks, Dan. I think we all share that sentiment. And again, I think this may be the second or the third year that we've been under the new third year. I think it's the third year under the new rate regimen, and it's worked out. And I think the report tonight reflects a lot more stability in how rates are managed than we were used to beforehand. So kudos for that. And I'll turn now to Councilmember Waive. Go ahead.
Thank you, Garth. So it's my understanding, just anecdotally, as I walk down the street, that we have 3 different sizes of residential cans, and the 32 being the middle size can. I know there's larger and there's a smaller one, and you use the 32 gallon as your mean number. Is that the size of residential can that most of our residents use, or do they use one on the other end? Do we know that data?
That's correct. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me right now. I know that I or folks from MSS can follow up with you after, but yes, that is the most commonly subscribed to residential service level.
So are the smaller cans and the larger can, not the 32, are they also being tabbed at 0.73% increase?
Correct. The recommendation is to adjust all rates uniformly by the 0.73% increase.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Paulson.
Thank you. Yeah, Garth, thank you very much. Good report. Just a couple questions. I mean, I'm really happy that, given the spike in inflation, people won't be seeing their garbage rates go up by even 1%. So that's really great news. But, looking over my notes from last year, I think you had about 250 staff members working at the Marin Sanitary. And if you could just give a sense of, how that dipped with PPP and where it might be going, because I'm thinking ahead to, the next rate and if there might be a rebound in the rates. And then the second question is, I think last year, either you were working on a biomass facility or it was already, online, but maybe you can say if that has any relevance to the 5 categories you presented. Thank you.
Certainly, and thank you for those questions. I will defer those to MSS themselves, and they can respond to a couple portions of that. I assume they're in attendance and usually appreciate an opportunity to address the council because I don't work for them. I work for you. But with respect to your second question on the biomass facility, I do happen to know because we've been working with them in other capacities to understand their intentions, Marin Sanitary Services intentions around a likely biomass facility. And so I imagine they can speak to that because I know it's something that they're passionate about and are working hard on. And it's also something that others in the community and the Marin community are working on as well, such as the Marin Biomass Group, and Zero Waste Marin's also adopted a new zero waste feasibility study update that also supports those kinds of goals. And so I'll defer to them on the biomass. I do know it's occurring, but I don't have the specific details myself. With respect to the staffing levels, I had some inquiry with MSS during this process just to find out kind of how they maintain staffing levels. I do know that it was their objective and intention to seek to maintain staffing throughout the entire time. And my understanding is they achieved doing that. Of course, with folks in and out for various reasons over the course of that period. I do think there will be some rebounding next year, right? So this is a brief moment of a respite in rate adjustments or rate increases due to a variety of factors, reducing tonnages, the sunsetting of some of those prior true ups, other factors that are at play that are kind of coming together to the benefit of the ratepayer overall. Next year may be a little bit of a different story. I don't expect double-digit increases next year and the following, and the methodology has means of being able to curb those types of increases. So for example, that 60% of the rate revenue for MSS operations that's pegged to that external index, it is capped. That portion is capped, so there's only so much by which that can go up on an annual basis. Pulling it out of my hat, I believe it's 5%, but I'd have to go back to be sure, but I'm relatively confident that's the case. But there are other factors that may come to be at play. I mentioned the rate revenue reconciliation, the kind of under collection of revenues compared to expectation in 2020. There is some of that still occurring here in 2021, and we still have a suppressed commercial economy. And so that will likely flow through to the 2023 rates. And, I think it'll be on the order of a couple of percent, 1 to 2% in terms of the overall rate adjustment. We may see more inflationary factors next year, recovery, with hopeful recovery, maybe we'll see increases in tonnage, although I think that there's also this opportunity to say, can we recover without increases in tonnage? Can we have a recovering economy without increasing the amount of waste we generate? And that's one of the most positive news about the rate adjustments this year. So I hope that answers your question about where we might be. I'll certainly let them respond to retention of employees and how that relates to the PPP loan and the biomass facility. They can address that themselves.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Any other questions from Garth for Garth? Thanks again, Garth.
Thank you
Appreciate
for the
again
time.
The presentation.
Thank you.
It was a great one. But as you suggested, we may have some representatives from the company in attendance. City manager, I see somebody just popped up.
Hi, if I may, this is Patty Garbarino, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm here with my dad, Joe, my hero, Joe. We're here also accompanied, I don't know that you can see us, but we're accompanied by Justin Wilcock, our operations manager, and Ruben Hernandez. He helps us with legislation, and also our CFO, Jason Wally. To get to your questions, I will in just a sec. I just want to reiterate how happy we are to be able to serve you and be at your disposal and take all of what we can in the way of your waste to its highest and best use and not have it wind up in the landfill. Catherine, your question first about the 32-gallon can, that is the can that is predominantly used. I think 85% of our customers in Larkspur and throughout our service areas are using that can because of the diversion programs that they're participating in with the paper products and the containers and the green waste and organics. But we do have the specifics of all of that information, including who's using a 20-gallon can, who's using a 32, 64, 96. So we've got all of that for you. There are not that many people that are using a 96-gallon can. As far as Scott, your questions about staffing, we did not have a change. It was you, Scott, right? Zoom is a challenge, or was it Gabe? It was Gabe, sorry. It was Gabe, sorry. Our staffing levels did not change. As you can imagine, we were considered an essential business. So we continue to roll throughout. As a matter of fact, a number of your residents put signs on their garage doors thanking us for what was perceived as normal because we came by with 3 trucks every week and kept rolling. We did apply for and got the PPP loan, and we do anticipate there being a forgiveness. We were told we would get that notification by November 8th as a part of hopefully dovetailing into the rate application. We, especially in the commercial, did suffer significant losses. I believe it was an annual loss of about 1.5 million last year. Looks to be the case this year as well. So we're sincerely hoping that we will get that forgiveness. If not, the rate, and Garth, correct me, that rate would have been more, just a little bit over 5% this year because of that loss. As far as biomass goes, we have an application before the City of San Rafael's Planning Department. We are fully vested not only for AD, actually, biomass and composting, but we've opted to lop off the AD facility permitting in order to expand on what we're doing in our partnership with CMSA, which is working out very well in our food waste to energy program. We have about, in our service area, 250 restaurants participating in that. Pre-consumer, so that material, that organic material is not in the landfill rotting, creating methane. With the passage of Measure C last March, a year ago March, we're also preparing for processing that material here at the MRF via the biomass so that we would be able to have one more option or one more program deemed as renewable energy and then sell that energy to Marine Clean Energy. Planning Department, it's in their hands now to approve the change. We've moved from 1 to 2 megawatts, and again, we'll expand upon the food waste to energy program. Overall, with 1383 and Measure C, we anticipate about a tripling of the flow of organic material coming through the facility in this next few years. I'm happy to answer any other questions and just delighted to be at your disposal. Thank you for hearing us out.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. We've enjoyed a terrific relationship with Marin Sanitary, and we look forward to continuing that relationship. You're a terrific partner, and we appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Unless there's anything else from the council, we can maybe open it up now to the public, if there are any public comments or questions.
Our first comment will come from caller ending 1402.
Go ahead.
James Holmes, Larkspur. I was impressed by the relatively modest increase until I learned that parts of Mill Valley got a 0.60 decrease. After reviewing the application and consultants' reports, I have several questions and concerns. First, a major factor in the increase was the SB 1383 mandate compliance costs. But SB 1383 mandates apply only to multifamily and commercial customers, not residential customers. Therefore, it seems a misallocation and to allow excessive cost recovery to impose SB 1383 costs on residential customers rather than on just the customers covered by that mandate and for which MSS has a separate rate schedule. Second, it's unclear whether the SB 1383 mandate costs are being passed through on a gross or net basis. The RE report, page 3, says the mandate will, quote, result in increased subscriptions to organic services throughout the MSS service area, unquote. These increased subscriptions will undoubtedly generate increased revenues, which will offset the increased costs. So are those costs gross or net? Third, SB 1383 expenses are termed anticipated according to the RE report, and it's unclear whether there will be any true-up to actual costs later. Fourth, MSS will realize a nearly $15,000 profit increase due to the increased mandate expenses. This seems contrary to the intent of the rate methodology, which was to quit automatically increasing profits whenever costs increase. The franchise agreement should in the future be amended to extend this concept to government mandates so that MSS will be incentivized to implement them in a cost-effective way. Fifth, a key issue is how unfavorably our rates compare with other similar communities in Marin, especially Corte Madera. Two issues here. First, for accurate and informative comparisons, the rate comparisons should show other communities' rates without the government fees so we can see precisely what the providers are actually charging. And finally, even with the government rates, the comparison bar chart on, I think it's page 8, shows that of the 15 Marin jurisdictions rates shown, 8 are lower than Larkspur, 4 are higher, and 3 are essentially the same. Clearly, Larkspur is not getting as good a deal as over half of the Marin jurisdictions. And as usual, Corte Madera rates are far lower than Larkspur's despite similar territory and terrain. We need to learn why we are charged so much more than Corte Madera. We should be savvy comparison shoppers. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Maybe Garth, is there anything you want to say in response to some of the comments that James has provided?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, happy to provide a bit of additional context. With respect to the SB 1383 mandates, it's not entirely accurate to say they only affect multifamily and commercial. It is applicable, and the council will be hearing an ordinance with respect to these mandates here in the coming weeks. But it is applicable to all generators of organic waste in the community, inclusive of single family, as well as multifamily and commercial. What is true is that multifamily and commercial have a bit of a higher bar to climb. There's some different expectations of them, and they don't tend to perform as well as single family waste generators do. The practice with such rate adjustments in Larkspur and the Marin Sanitary Service area has been to apply uniform adjustments. We have not sought to separate that amongst residential and commercial as a part of this methodology. With respect to the costs being on the gross or net, they are on the gross basis. And if there is additional subscription to composting or organics collection service that generates additional revenue, that goes to help to meet the annual revenue requirements and therefore offsets future rate adjustments. And so that is accounted for in the way the methodology works. It's not effective in this year, but if there's additional revenues that come into play, whether that's by growth in the economy or growth in subscriptions, and that results in growth in revenues, that all applies to the rate methodology or the rate need, the revenue need on an annual basis. With respect to operating margin or profit on the SB 1383 costs, those costs as proposed are just simply the cost of a truck, the cost of a driver, the cost of a recycling education coordinator, and a capital investment for a debagger at their facility for their food to energy program. That the costs as proposed are not inclusive of management or administration, overhead, anything else relating to the implementation of those costs. And so having a risk mitigation factor in an operating margin or a profit margin associated with those for their other administration and management of implementing those programs is essentially standard and appropriate in my opinion. And I can't speak to the differences between two different communities and two different providers. So Corte Madeira's rates for the 52-gallon service, comparatively speaking, are somewhat lower than those for Larkspur, as shown in our chart. But that's not a simple analysis to completely unwind all of the specific differences between communities, between haulers, between government fees. And the fact of the matter is you're in a long-term agreement with the MSS agency or entity, and you aren't in a position to immediately shop around unless you were to make a decision with respect to the franchise agreement you have now. And there was an introductory comment with respect to a rate reduction in Mill Valley. It's a totally separate rate methodology that Mill Valley Refuse Service has with its agencies. And there's also, different annual factors relating to that. One of the things I can say is that the agencies served by Mill Valley Refuse Service have not yet had to grapple with the unfunded mandate of SB 1383. Those efforts are underway now, and those outcomes and the impacts on their rates will be forthcoming in the coming year. I think that covers all the points, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, I think that it does pretty well. And just on the issue of, and thank you for pointing out that difference between our relationship with our vendor and Mill Valley's got a completely different situation. So that's apples and oranges. But the one thing I just wanted to note, just recalling back from previous year's presentations on that bar graph showing comparative rates, that bar graph looks pretty much the same as I recall from previous year's bar graphs. So it doesn't really indicate that there has been a material change in the relative position that Larkspur is in, relative, of course, to the other jurisdictions it's served by the same vendor. I think it's pretty much the identical bar graph, but I may be wrong.
That's correct. And, the vast majority of those agencies are served by two vendors, Marin Sanitary Service and Mill Valley Refuse Service, and those rates tend to go up in very similar fashion year to year, or the rates for their communities that they serve. The thing that actually has changed is some of the outliers have become a little bit more normalized, and specific the rates for the entities served by Recology, Sonoma Marin, being Nevada Sanitary District, and West Marin. Those are actually starting to creep up closer to the average or the mean of the other communities. There are a number of factors at play in those types of comparisons. If you look at the rate structure for 20 gallon or 64 or 96, they'll be similar, but there'll be some meaningful differences. But there's also the mix of commercial and residential in any community and what's being charged for commercial in those communities. It gets very difficult to peel back that onion and come to anything that's really conclusive. And again, the fact of the matter is, unless you were to seek to readjust your rate structure in Larkspur, the rate structure that you have today is the one that you're working with, as is the agreement that you have with MSS.
Well, thank you for those clarifications. Allison, is anyone else in the public that wants to contribute at this point?
I'm looking for any additional raised hands or emailed public comment. And there's no further public comment.
Okay, in that case, we'll close the public comment part of this agenda item, and we'll bring it back to the council. If there's any further discussion on this, I want to invite that. Otherwise, I'll be looking for a motion. I see our Vice Mayor's hand is up.
I'll move to adopt the staff recommendation, but I also want to comment and thank Mr. Holmes for his pretty good questions. And I also want to thank our Garth for his very thoughtful responses.
Yeah, agreed on both. So I think you started off by volunteering to make that motion.
Second.
So moved.
And we have a second from Gabe. I guess we can do a roll call vote.
Councilmember Kendall,
Yes.
Councilmember Paulson,
Yes.
Councilmember Waive, Vice Mayor Hilmer,
Aye.
Mayor Hara.
Yes. And
And
I
I'll
think
call once
Catherine
again for Councilmember Waive.
She's back on, but she may have had to step away.
We could wait one more minute to see if she's able to come back, and if not, we could just count her as absent for this vote.
That'd be fine. Let's give her a second longer, but I don't think we don't need to wait too long. And I think we can assume she's not going to return in time for us to finish this off. So we'll take your suggestion, Sky, and Allison, if you can mark Catherine as absent for this particular vote. I think with the rest of us, the vote is sufficient for the motion to pass.
Yes, thank you.
And with that, we will close agenda item 7.1, and we'll move on to our next public hearing item, which is agenda item 7.2, introduce and waive first reading of ordinance 1054 to adopt amendments to the Rose Garden Precise Development Plan and the Central Larkspur Specific Plan. And I think we have either two related items. So we can go ahead and have a staff report on this before we bring it up back to the council.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor Harroff and Council.
If I can just quickly introduce for you Mayor Harroff and members of the City Council. I have with us tonight is Lorraine Weiss. She is our consulting planner, works with the city and has worked with the city on a number of occasions on projects involving the Rose Garden, including some of the original building permit review, building plans, and a few other amendments over time. So she's experienced with the project, and she'll be giving the staff report on this item tonight.
Okay, great. Well, thanks and welcome back, Lorraine. And there you are back on the video. We hadn't seen you a moment ago, and you're a familiar face and a familiar voice. And welcome back, and go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Mayor Harroff and City Council members. The applicant is requesting approval to amend the Central Larkspur Specific Plan and Precise Development Plan standards in order to reduce the required 50-foot building and impervious setback requirement measured from the top of bank of the east-west reach of the Larkspur Creek to 25 feet from the top of bank. And secondly, the existing requirement for a 50-foot setback from the top of creek bank for a primary residential structure will remain except for lot 27 to maintain existing minor encroachment of the main residence into the 50-foot setback. The amendments include two things. First of all, the Central Larkspur Specific Plan or Class Standard 63B, Policy D65 Natural Resource Protection Standards. And secondly, the Governing Precise Development Plan as adopted under the original ordinances 972, 1004, and 1050. More specifically, the proposed amendments focus on development standards 4, 6, 10, 11, and 15, including their diagrams that depict the creek setback and natural buffers. The requested text amendments are desired in order for residents to enjoy a reasonable use of their backyards, to allow installation of impervious surfaces such as patios or accessory structures within the east-west reach of the 50-foot setback of Larkspur Creek. This request does not modify the land use restrictions within the 25-foot natural resources buffer. This change would allow installation of impervious surfaces such as patios or accessory structures within the rear yard spaces only. The upland habitat buffer will remain in a restored natural state consisting of restoration plantings of native trees and shrubs accented by native and non-native naturalized herbaceous plants. No primary structures would be permitted within the prescribed setback area. The amendments to the Central Larkspur specific plan can be found in attachment 4, and the amendments to the development standards of the precise development plan can be found in attachment 5. We have received 6 additional public comments, of which 2 express opposition and 4 express support. These have been forwarded to the City Council today. Last Tuesday, the Planning Commission reviewed the requested amendments, and they also heard from members of the public and received several letters of opposition focusing on a number of issues. The Commission generally did not support the extent of the amendments as proposed, though they suggested more specificity in terms of the impermeable surfaces and limited minor structures could be acceptable. The Commission recommended to reconsider wording of the proposed amendments to ensure permeability of the area within the setback and specify what types of structures could be permitted and include square footage. Staff is recommending approval of the proposed text amendments to the language of the class and development standards of the precise development plan to reduce the required 50-foot building and impervious setback requirement to 25 feet from the top of bank. Should the City Council wish to direct staff to provide more specificity in the text amendments, add a standard to specify the types of surfaces and structures and sizes that would be permitted, staff would be forwarding those text amendments at your direction. We do want to note that Planning Director Toth prepared a memo today that was forwarded to the Council, noting a small nuance in the drainage plan. A small amount of drainage could drain into the buffer area, and this was not anticipated, but it turns out, having reviewed some engineering drainage plans, developing in the rear yards is not as anticipated in those plans. Most of the developed portions of the sites drain into the detention system, though a narrow strip of land inside the fence lines drain outwards. These areas are narrow and would likely disperse runoff to be absorbed by the immediate buffer area within the site without discharge into the creek. In future evaluation, WRA, who was the biological consultant, concluded the limited extent of such runoff would not result in any significant impact to the biological resources along the creek and buffer area. However, WRA cannot conclude that there would be any potential impacts to water quality without further analysis by an engineer or hydrologist. Should the Council be inclined to approve the project as proposed, staff would suggest that an engineer or hydrologist be retained to provide analysis of runoff volumes in consideration of E12 analysis standards and to assess potential water quality impacts. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to entertain any questions of the Council.
Okay, thanks very much, Lorraine. And could you just clarify for me where things stand with the Planning Commission on this item? I was a little unclear about what came out of their last effort to consider this matter.
Sure, yeah. The Planning Commission basically made the recommendation to reconsider wording of the proposed amendments to ensure permeability of the area within the setback and specify the type of structures that could be permitted and include square footage. For instance, 120 square feet could be the maximum for an accessory structure. They just felt that there needed to be more specificity in the standards than what we had proposed.
And are those recommendations reflected in what's before us tonight?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Lorraine. Yeah, this is the planning director. talked, and just, I think, to clarify, the memo that we had sent earlier this week was a summary of the commission's discussion, and we don't have the final draft minutes. The meeting is available online, but I would summarize the recommendation of the commission was not entirely specific. It was generally that they did not support reducing the building and impervious setback entirely as proposed, 25 feet, rather considering an adjustment which would keep a requirement for permeable surface treatments, but to allow accessory structures to some degree. Particularly, they indicated possibly 120 square feet as a maximum size. But they did not go into greater specificity than that, other than to recommend that the council consider that kind of direction.
Okay, that's helpful, Neil. I appreciate that. Okay, any comments or questions from others on the council? I see Vice Mayor Helmer's hand is up.
I would like to propose directing the staff to draft revised wording and other information consistent with the Planning Commission recommendation, including square footage and type of structures. I think it's important because what we're doing is really deciding whether or not people can apply for projects. In order to review and approve projects, you need that specificity, in my opinion. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
And that seemed to be where the Planning Commission was going with that. And just to clarify your request, Dan, is it your suggestion that in order to make sure that the Planning Commission's input is properly reflected in whatever the staff might propose, that this may be sent back to the Planning Commission to make sure that they have that opportunity to review it before it comes to us for final consideration? Yes,
I think that may be helpful and also practical, given the further information that may need to be added related to state legislation. I won't go into it now, but there may be other information that needs to be included later that would continue that process.
Okay, I think that might be some good direction to provide. Anyone else from the council have any comments or thoughts on this matter? Gabe, hands up.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Lorraine, one of the suggestions you made, or you said that one possibility was to get an engineer to look at impacts, say we do adopt, the 50-foot, allowing for impervious, within 25 feet of the creek. I'm a little bit unclear. I mean, it's a 117-page staff report, and the original environmental impact report, I would think, of 2006 determined what environmental consequences might occur with impervious surfaces, and I mean that's something where I'd love to get a little more clarity. Let's say we do adopt the resolution, we do allow this to happen. To me, I'm in full support of Rose Lane homeowners enjoying their backyards to the extent possible. I think all of us are concerned about runoff. In my own Heather Gardens neighborhood, just a roof required putting a percolation system in the back. I mean, we're all trying to deal with the same runoff issues. So the environmental analysis is a little bit unclear to me, and perhaps you can shed some light. Thank you.
What I can say is WRA, who's our biological consultant, prepared a report. That report, though, only evaluated the biological resources in that area and how it would affect the creek. And that, of course, turns out being negligible. There's no significant impact at all. In terms of the actual hydrology and the amount of runoff, that just has not yet been evaluated based on the amendments that the applicant has requested. So we would have to go ahead and hire an engineering consultant or hydrologist to do the evaluation and then come back with the results to both the Planning Commission and the City Council. And that would be borne upon by the homeowners association.
So if I make, sorry, go ahead, Neil. I just wanted to.
Yeah, sorry, if I can, I just want to clarify for Councilmember Paulson, because in your question, your language was suggesting that we would be moving the setback to within the 25 feet of the creek. To be very clear here, the setback is not going from 25 feet into the creek. It's from 50 feet into the rear yards, and then 25 feet reduced to 25 feet. So it's entirely within the fenced yard areas of the creek. The buffer, which is now the 25-foot limit from the top of creek bank, remains entirely intact, and the impervious surfaces and structures setback is also retained within that 25 feet. So the request is from 50 feet to 25 feet, entirely within the already fenced yard spaces. So just to make sure you're clear on that, because the language in your question wasn't
Thank you for that clarification. So that the original 25-foot buffer remains.
Right.
Anything setback or impervious, there's a 25-foot buffer between the creek and any activity, including the fence line. So
right.
It's clear.
And I think to the clasp, and the other thing which is kind of emphasized a bit more in the memo I provided, is the EIR for the clasp was based on a project that maintained a 25-foot setback for buildings and impervious surfaces. And that the project was evaluated in the EIR and approved. Although it was modified, the project was eventually modified to include a 50-foot setback after many public hearings, but the EIR did not identify that as a mitigation factor. And I see.
Thank you. I think Vice Mayor Helmer, I had some more questions, but please.
Just to provide an additional clarification, it's my recollection from the planning process and the public participation that the 50-foot setback was a result of an additional consideration regarding the visual distance between major structures. So just to provide context, additional context for Neil's comment regarding the environmental impact statement was based on a 25-foot setback.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Gabe.
Yeah, and so Marin, I think you kind of clarified a bit. To paraphrase what you said, the current environmental studies and impact reports and understanding are that the biological impact is negligible with the 25-foot buffer. And by that, I understand, there's waterfowl, there's deer, there's fauna, any plant life or water life is not, as it has not been shown that, maintaining a mere 25-foot buffer would have any impact. Is that a correct restatement of what you said?
Yes.
Okay. And hydrology, is that specific to erosion or to, sedimentation, or what exactly would the hydrology cover?
Neil, do you want to go into that?
Well, hydrology covers a few different topics related to water. It's kind of a matter of concentration of runoff and potential effect on other properties, or concentrated runoff into creeks, runoff that might be carrying excessive materials or debris and erosion when you get heavy runoff and concentrated runoff into stream areas. So one of the basic principles of the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System process is to try to make sure that all hard surface runoff is dispersed and treated, goes through treatment facilities, and is dispersed before entering the the creek system, through the storm drains and before it enters the creek, as opposed to prior designs really tended to take hard surface runoff, collect it, and run it directly away from properties and away from buildings. Now the basic principle is to develop in ways that does not create additional on-site runoff off-site, and particularly into creeks and streams.
And Neil, but my understanding from the presentation is that the hydrology and the water quality impacts, not the biology, but the hydrology and the water quality impacts, that still has not been fully assessed.
Well,
the presentation that I heard.
Yeah, the principle we were working from was one that the initial EIR was based on a project that had the 25-foot setback, as opposed to a full 50-foot impervious surface setback. And the DIR had evaluated that and was fine. The project that was developed modified the drainage a bit from what was envisioned in the CLASP, but met the basic principles of the CLASP, and then more so. Newer standards towards managing stormwater and filtration systems, et cetera, were developed in that period of time. And the system is designed to largely take the developed sites, particularly in the single family residences, bring the water internally into the system through Filterra, and then empty into the bioretention pond, which you see at the eastern portion of the property. So in that pond, it's then collected, particularly in storm events, it's allowed to collect in there and be contained and go through filtration before it overflows and empties into the creek system. In many cases, the water will just collect into that biofiltration pond area and not even enter the creek. So the basic principle of all these sites appeared to be that they were now draining interior into that system, and it had, more than adequate capacity for, typical development, rear yard patios or accessory structures. The only thing we came to realize is, looking more closely and connecting the dots with the grading, is there actually is a grade break line within the back portion of these rear yards where the grade actually breaks out towards the creek. So there's a narrow band near the fence lines that actually arguably would drain off towards the buffer area. And so that's where we're identifying that those sites, that part of the rear yards were not captured in the design, in the initial design for the drainage. So there's no assumption of those getting developed in the way that the sites, the housing sites would. So that may be an issue. We really don't know until we kind of take a look at the calculation and see what the potential impacts might be of that. We think that could be done, or it depends if the council decides to really look at maybe just refining the current standard, at which point we may, determine, do we need to evaluate this more, or can we refine this standard in a manner and have that reviewed?
Okay.
Does that help?
I see some nods here. It does help, but it also kind of reinforces my impulse to have this matter go back to the Planning Commission. But I want to keep this open for other comments from council members. Catherine Way.
Hi, Lorraine. I was reading an email from 9 residents in the Meadowood district, and I just wonder if you might be able to comment on it. In considering allowing the reduced setback, will it create a higher bank on the Rose Garden side of the creek? Is there a way, if so, as the city of Larkspur studied, what impact this would have were the creek to flood beyond its banks? So right now we have a slope to these backyards, a slight slope. If we allow impervious material, could someone actually build up a berm or something, which would then be a redirect of flood water if that was to happen? Just to answer the question of the residents who are sort of on the opposite side of the creek.
Sure. I don't think it's anticipated that something such as a berm would be proposed. I think we were talking more minor improvements. And of course, it would have to go to the homeowners association for their approval first before it even comes to the city planning and building department. So I think that's sort of an extreme case, and I really don't believe that's what we had anticipated in minor proposals that could be in the rear yards of these properties.
Okay. And another emailer, another resident says that the water flow is not towards the creek, but it's it flows north from the property. So there's confusion that I'm having as to where the water is actually flowing, whether it is going north, whether it is going into the containment area, which is east, or whether it's coming right into the creek. So I hear Mayor Hoff's concern about not having a complete understanding of the hydrology here. Thank you for answering that. I think this was a concern that some of the neighbors who are across on the other side of the creek have. I'd like to hear what people, I know we have audience members, so eventually we might get some of this fleshed out with them too.
And Councilmember Waive, can I kind of add on one observation on that? Is the site was developed and graded and surcharged to bring the properties, the sites above the flood level. So these are not properties that are considered to be in flood level or in floodplain. Now that's not to say they can never be flooded, but they're not anticipated as being areas where you're really in a position of creating impacts by doing typical development. Now, again, these are properties that are adjacent to a creek. But the proposal here is not to, there's nothing in this proposal necessarily saying we're going to grade above, and putting in structures could have, if you get to significant severe flood events, now I'm not a hydrologist, but you can have all sorts of kind of effects of possibly slowing waters as well as narrowing a channel. So there's a variety of, if you put in some buildings, they may actually capture or divert water away onto the site versus opposite. But it's not a project where we felt there was the significance or the potential for flooding impacts, being that it's you've got 25 feet of buffer area and you're built above and out of the floodplain.
I think the residents had sent the email in, were not in part of the Rose Lane development. They were across into the meadow, right, which is lower down and hadn't been graded at that same level. That was what their concern appears to be, that the Rose Lane properties are graded higher and theirs are lower. So just making sure we're covering all the potentially impacted properties.
Thanks, Catherine. Anything else from the council before we open it up to the public?
Yeah, Kevin, I'm just going to wait until we hear from the public for my comments. Okay. Okay, perfect.
That's great. Well, in light of that, why don't we do that? We'll turn it over for public comments and questions, and after that, we'll bring it back to the council. So, Allison, is there anyone in the queue for public comment?
Yes, if I could ask Planning and Building Director Toft if the applicant presentation should come first, Is this the time that you'd like that?
Yes, I believe Mr. Wheaton is identified as being the presenter.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I'm sorry, that was a confusion on my part.
Yeah. No, that's fine. There are several parties involved as in the application.
Yeah, let's get that all out on the table before we open it up to general public comment.
Okay, I have brought Chris Wheaton over to provide the applicant's presentation.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Thank you. I've got a presentation here. I'm just going to try to pull up. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I wrote a letter in to the council this afternoon. I just want to make sure I read it so it's part of the public record if anyone else is listening and I hadn't seen that. Just from a personal perspective, I moved to the Rose Lane development in 2014. That's 7 years ago. And when I purchased the home, I received documents that were in the hundreds of pages because they included every regulation and environmental regulation, HOA materials, et cetera. And included in those documents, which I was aware of, were restrictions of that 20-foot area from the creek to my fence line. And I was aware that that was sort of restricted. It was maintained by the HOA. Nothing could be done back there. It was an environmental restriction, and was very happy to see that. It's a nice buffer. Understood that I could never develop that. Also in those restrictions was the fenced area, which is 25 feet from the back of my property to the fence line, and was also aware there were some restrictions on the impervious surface rules there. What I did learn was, and I know that based on participating in the planning commission meeting, there was quite a bit of feedback about the hours and years that went into negotiating all this. And so to the certain extent possible, like I appreciate that. And I coming in as a resident, we weren't really interested in renegotiating all that unless there were some facts that came to light that were different. And I think the facts that were different was when all this was set up, post negotiation, the properties were built up at a higher grade, especially right next to the fence line. They're pitched down to the north end, the street, and a sort of French drain system was implemented on the side of the properties that drain to the street. When we found out about that, we were surprised that the new home company didn't try to negotiate a little bit more ease of use of the permeable surface restrictions in the backyard. But if you think about it, they didn't really have a big financial incentive to open things back up, and they just left it up to the homeowners to sort of come back to do this. So we've invested as a group, the 7 homeowners along the creek side have invested quite a bit of money into doing an environmental report, getting legal fees to draft the agreement, and continue to bear the expense of this to try to amend it to reflect the new drainage system and pitching that existed in the properties. And we've been working. This isn't something that came up suddenly. I know some of the correspondence was like somehow we were doing this immediately. It's been 7 years since we purchased homes in the area, and it's taken us several years to figure out how we could address this. We've had meetings with Neil. We've had submitted information to them to try to work through this. So with that as an introduction, I just want to go through and kind of, I'm also presenting today as a member of the Rose Lane. And for the record, my name is Chris Wheaton. I'm a resident of Rose Lane. I'm a Creekside home owner and part of the Rose Lane development. The project site consists of 8 parcels, and this might give everyone a little bit better perspective. So we're talking about 51 Rose Lane all the way to 65 Rose Lane is the area we're talking about. And you can see the creek here running along the southern portion of our properties. The first 25 feet that we're talking about that goes from the creek to our fence line in the back, we're not touching. We've never planned on touching. We would not do anything to that area. What we're really talking about again is to the area that's in our fenced backyards, this area back here. And really, as we look at this, the reason for our request is we want to continue to maintain that 25-foot, what we call the habitat setback. But because the as-built conditions differed than what was originally approved, and that by as-built we mean after everything was approved, after all the studies were made, the ground was raised up higher close to the fence line, pitched to the front so that all the water would flow to the street and then would flow down the street east through the drainage system to the retention area. So it's one of the best water treated systems you have that is inspected annually. It's maintained annually. I'm an HOA board member. We spend quite a bit of money to maintain that water. It is some of the cleanest water you're going to see that's going to fall in someone's backyard. And there's a difficulty for the property owners as it currently stands to know what can be approved and what can't be approved in the backyards. As an additional, just to give you an idea of the drainage here, the French drains that appear here are in our backyard property, and they're on the left and right sides of each of the properties, and the water would flow into those drains and would basically flow. You see the arrows, that's where they're flowing north to the street. There's drains then here, these things next to here, there's drains along the street. It then flows down the street into this area over here on the east side. And Neil's memo also discusses the other drainage that is in the backside of these properties. So that would give you an idea of the type of drainage system that appears there. So it's basically back and sides all the way to the street. Also, to mention, part of the reason that this drainage system exists is when they built up the properties, they really compacted the clay and the surfaces. So some of that seeps in, and then some of it, the remaining amount, is able to flow to the street. And if there was flooding back here, there's drainage systems back here that would continue to move that water to the street level. And it costs a lot of money. This is just another chart that's showing, this is a lot 27, just to give you one of the lots, an example of one of the lots. And you can see here, this is the creek, this is south, this is the upland habitat area and buffer area that's protected. And there's a fence line here, and then what we're talking about is just this area that's back here. It's a 25 feet is not a huge area that we're talking about relative to the overall property. Slide 6. And the next slide shows the demarcation of the 50-foot impervious surfaces buffer superimposed over lot 27. And you can see the area between the green line and yellow line is the fenced-in area, and the area between the yellow and red line is the upland habitat creek buffer. And it's important to reiterate that the upland habitat creek buffer would be protected. And the next slide shows the 50-foot impervious surface buffer affects the 8 parcels associated with the proposed request. So this is looking down the street, again, water flowing from these fenced areas to the street and then out. We've listened to the public comment, we participated in the planning commission, and we respect and appreciate the complicated process prior to development. However, it was a bit of a flawed process because there was no one to advocate for the future homeowners in that process. There may have been several constituents, affordable housing, elder community development, environmental groups, new home company, but we were not represented there. So I feel like this is our opportunity to sort of make our comment. And the new home company basically could compromise on anything that they thought they could still get past the buyer. So they didn't have a financial incentive at some point in time to really fight for any changes to this impervious surface restriction. Also, just again, the as-built grading, the grading that happened after all the approvals that improved the project in terms of flow and drainage were built in to accommodate this. And the state and local city of Larkspur approved the stormwater system, which is really state-of-the-art, effectively guarantees that percolation and runoff into the ground and back into the stream through an ecologically friendly filtration system. There was some comment about building cement structures and filling in with cement that habitat setback area and developing that and putting a berm in. I can tell you that that is protected and we don't plan to touch that. And WRA has provided as, again, an opinion saying there's no harm to the biology of the basin by us changing the impervious surface guidelines. Also, their LSA does annual reporting. That's an environmental consulting firm to show the subdivision complies with all conditions of approval. Again, the water system is inspected and maintained on an annual basis also. So quite a bit of protections for the water that's flowing from those backyards. And there's no reason to believe that we already have lighting in the backyards. We already have people with impervious decks or pervious decks, other structures that meet with the current standards. So there's already noise and light, and we're already in the neighborhood. So we don't anticipate any material changes to the noise or light in the neighborhood. And then this chart just shows the 1940s picture of the area, and now shows the development. There's been quite a bit of development there, and quite a, the area we're talking about is just a small 25-foot strip that's in our backyards that does flow out and is treated. The water is treated. So, we're asking just really to use half of our backyards for purposes of doing and enjoying those backyards like we would have any other resident would. To the extent that there is pushback on this, and I know the Planning Commission was proposing, if you listen to the hearing, there was just a fairly last-minute proposal there. I don't think it was necessarily thought through by all the planning members. I think they were just trying to come up with something that might make sure that we truly evaluate all this. But the 120-foot proposal is to go from us proposing that we're able to put items that are not impervious in our backyards and not have a restriction, and to go to 120 square feet seems a bit harsh, quite frankly, and seems like a radical restriction. I think we are open as a group to say that rather than having 100% freedom in the backyard, we're willing to restrict that down to, say, a standard of like 60%. I think you're better off putting a percentage on it versus like limiting it to a particular item or a particular amount of square footage. So even though we're asking for full use of the backyard, of the 25-foot backyard, which is really full use of half, so it's 50% of our backyard being able to use, I think there's been talk within our group of saying we'd be willing to accept something around 60%, where we'd be able to use 60% with a 40% restriction. Just something to think about as you go through that. And I'd like to reserve any additional time just to respond if there's questions, and open it up to questions from the council.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. That was a very thoughtful presentation and good graphics and good discussion. Any members of the council want to raise any questions or comments as a result of Chris' presentation now before we go on to others? Vice Mayor Helmer's hands up.
Thank you for your presentation, Chris. I just wanted to get a clarification from you, your I guess, final comments. You were talking about freedom to use 60%, and you were opposed to a 120 square foot restriction. You used the word restriction. I heard that reference to 120 square feet to be describing the size of accessory structures that would be allowed in that usable portion of the or area of the rear yard where the impervious surfaces would be allowed, that 25-foot zone. Am I understanding it correctly? That was a reference to the size of accessory structures versus some freedom to use 60% of. I wanted to understand what you were meaning when you were talking about that.
Yeah, I'm here with my partner Heidi Scoble, who lives with me at 53 Rose Lane. I was going to let her chime in on that.
Hi, good evening, Mayor Haroff and members of the City Council. I just wanted to clarify Chris's last remarks. So the residents are requesting, instead of 100% use of the backyard area, based on the concerns, if we could reduce any type of impervious surfaces to 60% of that 25-foot yard setback. Regarding the accessory structures, we're a little concerned that 120 square feet might be too limiting. And the reason being is that if you're proposing a pergola or some type of shade structure, 120 square feet is really small for that. And that type of structure would technically be considered impervious surfaces, but or could potentially be considered impervious surfaces. So
well, I have another question then. I was not considering a pergola to be an accessory structure limited by that 120 square foot size. I guess staff should help me understand the difference. I was thinking of actual buildings, enclosed buildings back there limited, that would be considered an accessory structure. But furthermore, down the line, there's state legislation that needs to be clarified that might impact that as well. So
yeah, and I think the challenge is that there are no definitions regarding what impervious surfaces really means to this subdivision, and that's our challenge. Planning and Building Director had prepared a memo in 2014 that identified certain features that could be considered impervious or permeable surfaces and those that wouldn't be allowed, but we don't actually have any hard and fast policy. We can't 100% rely on the Larkspur zoning ordinance because we don't really have clear definitions related to impervious surfaces as well. So that's pretty much what our challenge is. We want to be treated like all the other residents in Larkspur for single family, but we don't know how to use this area. So I'll just leave it at that, and then hopefully staff can answer your question regarding the accessory structures.
Yeah, and I would just add, like, if you think about a pergola and it has a roof on it, then that might be considered impervious. So, and if you wanted to have it big enough to put furniture in it, you start to get in much bigger than 150 square feet. Or there was at least one resident who wanted to put like an exercise pool, which is not a full pool, but just something that would rest and be able to exercise and swim during COVID. That was 250 square feet. So we start to run into, we'd much rather have it defined in terms of a percentage area than have it like a square footage area, because then it just ends up being, we're already having a hard time where things are having to go through the HOA board and through the city of Larkspur interpreting this, and it's just creating a lot of extra time for all of us to try to figure it out. And if you left it more open-ended and on a percentage basis, I think it frees up time for the planning department and the HOA to be able to have more freedom to award projects on that basis.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is the reason I agree with you. I think we need more specificity, and I think your thinking is rational, and but we should get some specificity on exactly what kind of structures, and there may be other considerations, height, etc. So I think we need more specificity.
And then that's what seemed to be lacking from where we were with the Planning Commission before, which is why their involvement may be appropriate. Councilmember Paulson?
Yeah, and kind of dovetailing on the Vice Mayor's comment, I'm wondering if specificity, in the different, planning parameters, if it's, a simple pergola, or if there's a roof, or, whatever, how that might also relate to any further studies like hydrology. So, I mean, that seems to be the gap from our earlier conversation. And, being very concerned about flooding in general. I know we have a pump station, and the bend is eroding quite bad at the corner of the creek. I would just like to, get some data and, perhaps, see what different scenarios would impact. So it could be a fairly objective-based design standard. I mean, again, I appreciate, Chris's comments, and I think, you guys should be able to enjoy your properties. I just don't know that we have enough information to really see what all the impacts are. And again, it's a pretty dense report, so I'll read it again, but I would love to have a little more input from staff on some of the questions that were asked.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to remind the council that this is the public comment portion of the public hearing, and this is an opportunity to ask questions of the applicant's representatives. Just trying to keep the hearing organized.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Scott. That's an appropriate comment. Catherine, I think you had your hand up.
Actually, it's a question. I'm curious about this defined as a percentage of area as opposed to specific structure square footage. Neil, is there another area of homes in Larkspur that are adjacent to any other waterway that we have a percentage? Like anything in Creekside, anything in Hillview? Is this a policy measure we've already done before?
Well, and it's hard for me to say with certainty about every neighborhood or planned development near or along the creek, but I would say in general, in my experience, most of the older neighborhoods that were built prior to these standards, we don't even necessarily have creek setbacks at this point. And they are limited only by site coverage limitations and floor area limitations. So flat work is not always triggered or requires a permit, and it doesn't always trigger these setback issues unless you're at a point you're on hillsides or something and you're raising and creating elevated grades or structures into setbacks or near creeks and waterways. So there are, and I believe Riviera Circle has some tide lines that are defined, but we don't have any neighborhoods, I think, along the creeks that have this level of a definition and this kind of control. And by definition, I do agree. Heidi's point is, Ms. Scoville's point is well taken in that when this was applied, there wasn't a lot of specificity as to exactly what an impervious surface is. And if you take it by its strictest definition, literally any kind of outdoor feature or structure is potentially impervious. So kind of applying a more flexible standard of, well, if you put out pavers, grasscrete, things like that are very absorbent and permeable, those are probably acceptable. Something like a trellis, an open trellis might be acceptable. But a pergola, clearly you're creating something that's roofed or volumed. You're now creating something impervious. And that's been the challenge we've had with the HOA and the property owners, is kind of like what's okay and what's not. So I don't know of an area that has this kind of level of specificity, but I would say on the flip side, many communities are developing more stringent creek setbacks in areas, particularly where they're in flood zones or potentially within flood level of creek. Again, this was built above that hazard flood zone, but this is kind of unique for Larkspur, and it's applying a little bit of a different standard than what applies to around the other properties. But again, it was built fairly recently, and it is adjacent to the creek.
Thanks for that. That's understood.
Okay, Vice Mayor Helmer, another question for Chris and Ms. Silva.
A question for Neil, the planning director.
Okay.
Would this is not a consideration of providing anything by right? This would, am I correct? This would require review and approval for projects, correct?
Well, projects that trigger permits. So there are small projects and improvements that don't always trigger permits.
I understand, but the anything significant that could require a review for, compatibility and with the principles of the specific plan, including, that distance between structures on both sides of the creek, major structures, not accessory structures, right?
Well, that's one. Yeah, and I think one reason and the applicants, when we were sort of vetting, okay, what exactly is it you'd like out of this change? I think they all agreed they're not trying to expand the residences. I mean, obviously, significant changes to the site could trigger precise plan approval changes anyway. But their intent was not to have additions or anything project from the structures, particularly like second story type additions, but to alleviate this particular. So that's why we came up with the maintaining a 50-foot setback for primary structures.
Well, in the event someone would propose a 35-foot square footprint pergola with a roof at 6 and 12, that could be a significant looking structure. Would that require the sort of review?
35 foot high?
No. Well, 35-foot square, say, 15-foot, 20-foot high.
Yeah, because the typical accessory structure limits are 15 feet in height, and anything over 120 square feet is subject to a building permit.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify, this is to allow applying for projects. Not right. The decision tonight is about whether they should be allowed to apply for projects, and then we have standards and guidelines that would go with those reviews.
And I would say projects that trigger building permits are reviewed by Public Works for having adequate drainage.
But also compatibility with the specific plan.
Neil, I see you're nodding. Is that a yes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the specific plan allows for accessory structures within the guidelines of the code for most other residences, for most other units.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just for clarification, the building permits are not discretionary permits. So
right,
as long as the project as proposed doesn't trigger design review or something that would require discretionary review, it wouldn't get it. Any other comments or questions for Chris and Ms. Sobel? Not seeing any. Allison, do we have any other presenters before we go to public comment?
We are in public comment.
Well, but general public comment. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm not aware of any other presentations. I'm happy to go to the next public comment speaker. We'll hear from Mark Atkinson.
Okay, Mark, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So first of all, let me thank the mayor and the vice mayor and the council members for considering this matter. I'm a resident of one of the 8 houses, and when we moved in, it was clear that the backyards of our houses, which face the creek, were clearly prepared for a higher elevation, which drained all of the water from the fence line back into the Larkspur development and into the biofiltration area. So, from a hydrology perspective, and again, I'm not an engineer, but what I would say, Neil, is that for 8 houses, it's not a matter of looking at how the paperwork ended up. It's probably a matter of sending somebody to look at the backyards. And I can tell you that my backyard is almost a foot higher than the grassland outside of my fence. So to me, my experience has been in any rain in Larkspur, all the water has basically flowed into the drainage and out. So I think that, what Chris Wheaton has been trying to emphasize is that the hydrology consideration is really that all the water in our backyards is flowing into a development that was engineered to filter that water at the eastern end of the compound. And all I can do is just attest to the fact that every time I've seen a heavy rain, my backyard has drained into the street side on the other side of the house, not into the creek. And one of the things we were actually required to do was to test those drainage systems when we moved in. So we basically put hoses down them and made sure that water could freely flow from our backyards out through the front and into the street area. So I feel that, again, look, this is a qualitative comment. I'm not an engineer, but I think what it's going to require is somebody to look at how things actually ended up in the backyards, not what they ended up on a drawing.
And if I can comment on that, I appreciate the comments, because certainly what we're doing, our exercise to this has been kind of connecting the dots relative to the drainage plans and the plot plans and the grading as shown on the plans. And that's a very good point, is what exactly really, how did it get built? Because it may be, there are adjustments in the field, and and that may well be the case. So something worth considering.
Okay. Let's see if there's anyone else in the public queue.
Next, we'll hear from Julia Lecta.
Hi, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Haroff and Vice Mayor Hilmer and council members Candle, Paulson, and Way. My name is Julia Lecta. I live in one of the smaller senior condos in the Rose Lane Terraces at 71 Camellia Circle. I'm also a board member of the Rose Lane Master Association, so I'm familiar with the application, but I'm here tonight in my individual capacity. And first off, I'd just like to say how much I appreciate the diverse residences of Rose Lane and the fact that the city put in the hard work necessary to negotiate the rather complex development that Rose Lane is. It's a great neighborhood mix, and I support the application of my neighbors because, viewed from my perspective as somebody in that community, it's a relatively modest request to lift what appears to be a redundant restriction on impervious surfaces for that part of the creek setback that really is their backyards. As I pointed out at the Planning Commission hearing, the backyards are surprisingly small, and the residents have been surprisingly creative in the way they've used them. I think that they did not anticipate the problems that the impervious surface restriction on top of everything else in those backyards would create for them. And I'm convinced, as a layperson, just listening to everything and working with this application, I'm convinced that that the lifting of the impervious surface restriction is not going to create a runoff problem or a flooding problem for other areas, such as the Meadowwood or Heatherwood areas. And in fact, they have benefited, I think, from the development being built and from what was basically a haphazard way of controlling the water in that area to a very well-functioning water management system. So that's been a plus. And also, I think it's been a plus to have Rose Lane there developing the immediate buffer for the creek. There's been a lot of work done with Rose Lane money, with assessments, my assessments, to improve the natural habitat around the creek. And this is something that you can see. It's really something that the community has every intention of continuing to protect, and the notion that somehow we are trying to look for a backdoor out of the grand plan that was arrived at to allow this development does not pass the common sense test.
Julie, if you could, we've been going on for about 3.5 minutes. If you wouldn't mind, could you try to wrap it up, because we probably have some other folks in the
That's
queue.
fine. Yes, because I'm right here at the end. So
Great.
I do support the application, and I want to point out one further thing very quickly, and that is the Heatherwood neighbors should think about putting in their own buffer fence, because the real, now we're not talking about flooding, we're talking about creek protection. The real damage to the creek and to the habitat is occurring on the Heatherwood, Meadowwood side, because there is no buffer protection there. There's, for the teenagers, dogs, trash, anything, that's completely unprotected in terms of runoff. And so that ought to be one place where they could constructively focus their energies. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Julie.
The next comment will come from Alex Letnick.
Good evening, Alex. Mayor. Yeah, thanks. And just as a reminder, we're trying to keep this part of the public comment to have individuals limit their comments to about 3 minutes, and I'll be running a clock on it. So
great,
go
thanks.
ahead.
It should be less than 3 minutes. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and Council members. My name is Alex Letnick. My partner Joe Karuba and I are residents of 51 Rose Lane, which is one of the 8 Creekside homes. On October 7th, we sent an email to the Planning Commission communicating that we no longer supported our neighbors' ask for revisions to the precise plan. And we'd like to share more details about our concerns and why we don't support the current proposed changes. When initially approached about this, and we're the newest additions, we moved in 2019, we expressed our concerns about how it may increase levels of noise pollution. One of the people coordinating this assured us that anytime something that creates a mechanical noise would be placed in a backyard, it would go through the design review committee per our CC&Rs, and that adjoining neighbors would be able to express any concerns. Since that time, we learned that this is not what is always done in practice. This raised concerns for us about how any proposed changes would be overseen and implemented when we currently do not have a consistent process and or a shared understanding of the process. It was at that point that we withdrew our support to amend the precise plan. Since then, we have additional concerns. The WRA Environmental Consultants Report noticeably did not include an exploration of noise impacts on the habitat, particularly as it relates to things with motors and pumps that may be placed in our backyards. A large body of research describes the ways in which human-generated noise impacts nesting behaviors and predator-prey behavior, particularly acoustic predators like owls and bats. And the introduction of more artificial unfamiliar noises to the Creekside area could have long-term effects on ecosystem diversity and structure. Now, we are aware that in our application letter that was submitted on March 3rd to Director of Planning and Building Neil Toft, that it stated any lighter noise we add would occur during daylight hours and would be minimal. Based on recent experiences, we are not confident that our HOA has the willingness and or ability to adequately oversee and, when needed, enforce this. It is highly likely that among our 8 Creekside families, more than 8 different opinions exist about what is an acceptable level of noise. We were surprised to learn during the Planning Commission meeting that the proposed revisions would allow accessory dwelling units to be placed in our Creekside backyards. This is not something we were told when our Creekside neighbors asked for support to submit a letter asking for changes to the precise plan. In fact, the letter that we submitted on March 3rd, and this is on page 3 of that letter, says that our request is to allow tool sheds and playhouses not to exceed 120 square feet in area. We're not sure how that then resulted in a proposed change to allow ADUs. It seems that prior to introducing the text amendment at the Planning Commission meeting, Creekside homeowners should have had the opportunity to review it to ensure it reflected our collective understanding of what we were asking for. This is another example of the ways in which the inconsistencies and communication gaps concern us. Speaking of communication gaps, we would like to note that we were not included in the conversations that our neighbors Chris and Heidi spoke to towards the end of their presentation about neighbor consensus regarding size of structures and percentage of use. This is also troubling. Our feeling is that more time is needed to create a shared, clear vision of what our proposed asks are from the city. This would ensure that our asks are in alignment with our responsibility to maintain the well-being of the Creekside habitat and that they maintain harmony among the Creekside homeowners and also the wider Larkspur community. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time and wish a happy Hanukkah to any who celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Allison, anyone else?
Yes, our next comment will come from Suzanne Loesch.
Okay, Suzanne.
Hi, thank you, City Council members. I have lived with my husband, Bill, in Rose Lane since 2014, and we're Creekside homeowners. What I'd like to do is provide 2 examples that bring to life what living with the impervious surfaces restriction in the setback area means on a day-to-day. So example number 1, the first 5 years we lived here, we had terrible experiences with umbrellas in the backyard. It's really, really windy. And so we decided to get a pergola. Our pergola is 16 feet by 16 feet, which is 256 square feet. And when we asked if we could put a cover on it so that we could actually have shade, the planning department said no, because the roof is an impervious surface. So what about some type of a fabric to block the sun? Again, no, because fabric that blocks the sun is an impervious surface. And given the south facing orientation of our backyards, not being able to have shade in your backyard that's, reliable is a real burden. We have a city permit for the pergola. The county reassessed us. We paid property taxes on the pergola, yet we are prohibited from fully enjoying it. So tonight isn't about what kind of pavers we're allowed to have. It's about our quality of life. Okay, example number 2. Hot tubs are allowed in the setback area as long as they're portable. But what happens when a homeowner wants to lower it a foot or 2 into the ground to make it easier to get into or quieter? Well, once you bury the hot tub in the ground, it's harder to move it and it's no longer portable. And now its impervious surfaces status rears its ugly head and the hot tub is no longer allowed. So what's allowed is arbitrary. And if you look at our backyards, what you'll see is very, very few improvements and mostly open space. And this has real cost to us. We are trying so hard to follow arbitrary rules that we are underutilizing our backyards in the ways that they're even currently allowed. And it takes an inordinate amount of time. Homeowners, the HOA, the city, trying to figure this out. I personally have probably spent 500 hours trying to lift these restrictions because they're really that draconian. And what this is the impracticality of living with an absolute 0, no exceptions standard. And now with the need for social distancing and gathering outdoors because of COVID, our backyards have never been more important. Since my husband and I purchased our home, the world has changed in ways that none of us could have imagined. In closing, relaxing the impervious surfaces restriction and granting us a wider array of accessory structures would go a long way in improving the quality of our lives, solving problems, and allowing us more enjoyment of our backyards. There's more in my letter if you'd like to see it. My husband and I support this amendment. We urge City Council to approve it. Also, I was the author of the applicant letter, and on page 3, we do have specificity in terms of the types of accessory structures we're requesting beyond.
Suzanne, we'll take a look at the letter, and I appreciate that. We're just kind of running a little overtime here.
Yes, and ADUs are nowhere part of our request. I'd like to clarify that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
Our next comment
next in the queue.
Our next comment will come from Peter Krasnoff.
Yeah, hi Peter. And again, let me just, because we're everyone's taking a little bit of time here, so please try to keep your comments to 3 minutes, or because I am running a clock, and I'm going to be a little more rigorous with that.
Thank you, Mayor Hara, Vice Mayor Dan Hilmer, and the rest of the council members. And I also want to thank the planning staff, because it does appear that many of the comments we made at the last meeting have been incorporated. I just wanted to emphasize the importance of the hydrology study, because I think that's an essential element that is being misinterpreted or maybe misunderstood. The state requirements are that the pre and post construction of the Niven development runoff be the same. And so what that means is the amount of runoff that happened before all the paving and all the homes that were there be equivalent to what was there when this was the Niven nursery. So to do that, the designers of the project had to incorporate a number of elements to make sure that the runoff was the same. And I believe that part of that analysis includes the use of these impervious surfaces. And so the volume is a critical factor. So I just want to make sure, and I believe this has been identified by council, that this is a consideration. I just want to request that prior to the approval of this modification, that the runoff be considered. I also want to help clarify that the treatment pond that exists there does not treat 100% of the water that flows through it. It has a capacity and an overflow, and that this additional water that would be added would be part of that overflow, because it only treats about 80% of the design storm as it was designed. So I know there's a belief it's this very advanced system. It doesn't remove dissolved constituents. It's not going to fix the volume of runoff that leaves, that does lead to increased erosion and increased runoff and flooding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And you did good. 2 minutes. Thanks. Next in line.
I'm looking for any additional raised hands or emailed comments. If we hear from James Holmes.
James, go ahead.
James Holmes, Larkspur. I agree with the Planning Commission's recommendation for more specific wording regarding the standards that would govern the yards if the proposed amendment were adopted. Based on the information provided to the Commission at its hearing, it seemed that the language which would kick in if the amendment were approved could allow much more extensive projects than the applicants say they want. So in their application. So I think the governing language should be refined to conform to the applicant's declared intent in their submittal. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Anyone else?
I'm looking for any additional raised hands or emailed comments. And there's no further I see we have a hand raised of someone who's already spoken. Would you like to return to speakers?
If that's the only person, yes, and let's try to keep it very brief. Peter?
Actually, this is Karen Ellingbo. I'm working on the same computer that Peter is, so he's not speaking twice. I just wanted to reiterate, I think the hydrology considerations we're talking about here, I think a lot of people don't understand the volume of runoff is extremely important, and it isn't this isn't just about the biology. It's not an opinion, it's a state regulation and requirement that must be met. And the reason for it is to protect our waters from pollution and help prevent additional erosion and protect our habitats. The state has very rigorous water safety, water protection regulations, and I don't think they're being met unless there's some sort of, you have to demonstrate that by doing some sort of engineering or hydrology review of the possible changes. And the possible changes could be wide open without a lot of specificity. As Vice Mayor Hilmer suggested, once you open that door, the whole area could be a patio or a pergola, or and so you're dealing with a potential that goes beyond the indicated intentions of the current inhabitants. So I would encourage you to follow up with some sort of engineering or hydrology review, and also follow up with some specific requirements if it is going to move forward in terms of what's permittable. Dan Kunstler, Commissioner Kunstler, indicated, you know, there's a lot of products that could be used to create patios and other things that are permeable and would not affect the infiltration and runoff as much as other pavers or roof lines and whatnot. So that's something to consider. The other thing which I would just urge is, I know this seems difficult, but because it's very hard to enforce any requirements there, and Planning Director Toft mentioned that at the last meeting, that a lot of what gets done there is not up for any sort of review. It might be, if you really want to maintain standards for runoff, you might need to have some sort of annual review. We can't rely on the homeowners association to police it for you. And so that might be another way to get at it, is just to take a look at it and make sure that it's meeting requirements that get set up in the language. So that's it.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for that. Allison, anyone else?
I'm looking for any final raised hands or emailed comments. And there's no further public comment.
Okay, well, that will then conclude the public comment for this matter. I'll bring it back to the council for any further discussion. And I'm not seeing any, so, well, Catherine, there you go. Saved by the bell. Go ahead.
Saved by my raised hand there. For those of you who are still here as our participants for chiming in about this, this has been a development with a lot of conversation that's gone along with it for many years, even before I was even involved in it. And it's a fascinating parcel too, to think about how that Niven property was a commercial nursery from 1923 to 1987. So it's not a pristine water source, never had been since 3 creeks were diverted to create the one that exists there now, but that's a little bit of the history. I think we have a lot of unanswered questions right now. I think we have some questions about hydrology. I think we do have some questions about what is the definition of an impervious surface, and whether percentage of use of property versus actual square footage is a better indicator of how we should permit use of the space. So I have some unanswered questions about that. I don't feel like the Planning Commission really left us with some direction on that matter. On the other hand, I do think we have a relatively modest request, which is really only 8 homeowners, maybe one not, who's interested in more of a complex conversation about noise. We have some hydrology questions as to whether the drainage is actually engaging itself to the north of the property or south of the property. So I feel like we have a lot of unanswered questions that I think we need to resolve. Although personally, I feel that this is a relatively modest request by 8 homeowners. I still am concerned that we need to make sure we do our due diligence in getting definitions to some of these questions of what is pervious and impervious, so that we are clear to make potential other developments as to where they should go with this. So I'm more interested in making sure we clarify what those terms are, so that we can have a better sense of commitment to our residents and also enforcement should there be an issue of an impervious structure or that does have a dramatic impact. So putting that forward, I really appreciate, Chris, if you're still on the call. That was a very good presentation, and I know you spent a lot of time on that. Very good photos. That really helped for me to clarify where the boundaries were that we were discussing. I walk that path almost every day. And with a lot of the foliage that's built in there, I was unaware of those border lines that you were. I felt like your visuals really helped in that creation of my understanding of that process. Sort of where I am now. I'd like to hear from my other council members.
Okay, and Catherine, just for clarification, because all your points were excellent. Do you have a suggestion about how we should, as a matter of procedure, go forward here?
I would defer to Vice Mayor Hilmer and his process and understanding of how we may engage with the Planning Commission to further explore some definitions so that we can make a policy decision with clearer definitions.
Okay. Well, I think that was a great tee up for Vice Mayor Hilmer, who has his hand up anyway. Go ahead.
I had a clarifying question. Well, first, I think we should direct this back to the Planning Commission for more detail on what's about the wording, the process, and what kind of surfaces and structures would be under permit review. But I have a question on, I guess it's definition of how we calculate. Should we go to a percentage? Because if you have paving that's impervious covered by a roof, for example, would that be calculated as twice the area, the footprint area, in a percentage standard? For example, 60% of the 25-foot zone behind the house for impervious surfaces. Would that then put a limit on a covered patio that would be impervious? And I just want to make sure we're understanding intent and how these tools are going to be used, as much as we can before we send it back to the Planning Commission. Neil, do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah. I mean, I guess one point is when evaluating development, there's Bay Area standards. There are engineering standards applied throughout the Bay Area, and Julian, our Public Works Director, could probably elaborate on that. But I think just to kind of keep it simple, it's generally approached, number one, it's like a bird's eye view. So it's not a matter of things layering on top of each other. It's kind of how much of an area is, of a given area is impervious, or how, and sometimes there can be somewhat pervious features too, which might have certain runoff coefficients. So there are ways that that's calculated.
But aren't the standards consistent with the view that if you have, it's about calculating the runoff? So are you saying just because something's covered, there is not additional runoff by having two areas that are impervious, one over the other?
If it's one over the other, it's considered, and they're both impervious, then it's really whichever one is the bigger structure. It's the footprint that's going to be the impervious surface.
Okay, I just want to make sure from the runoff calculation perspective, I want to make sure we're consistent with a definition that's used by everybody. Thank you.
Councilmember Candell, I think your hand's up.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody who spoke. Really appreciate the input. From my perspective, our job as a council is to maximize the usage of the residents until it affects the environment or the water, all the things that we're talking about here. I don't think any of us on the council are experts in this area, and we need to rely on staff. So I would ask that when we give it to staff, that's basically what we're looking for. We're looking for what is a way we can maximize the usage by residents without negative impacts, with specifics. When staff comes back, I would love to hear, this is what is harmful, this is not. This is how you define what's harmful. If you're saying it's impervious, how do you define impervious? What counts as impervious, what doesn't? Because I don't know. And it would be silly for me to try to make something up when it's outside my scope of expertise. So my opinion is, let's let the experts come back to us. I mean, that's what they're there for. And, that's what I would be asking for as a council member. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. Gabe, we haven't heard from you in this round. If you'd like to say something.
Yeah, I think basically Councilmember Wei, summarized the issues very well, and I support what she's asking for. That hydrology is a question. I think definitions. Some of the various members spoke about the arbitrariness of it, and also their intent not to have ADUs. I just think we need clarity. The only thing I'd add to that is I think there should be a connection between the definitions and the impact reports, so that we don't merely define that we can't have ADUs. We do that based on, as Councilmember Candell was saying, we're trying to maximize benefit, but ensuring that it doesn't impact the environment or the flow or the hydrology. I did have one question, perhaps for Director Toft. What would the cost of a hydrology report be?
I think it's very hard to say. We haven't spec'd that. And again, one of the reasons we didn't do it initially, because the presumption is these were areas that were anticipated, at least within the planned development and drainage, to include the same types of structures as in any backyard area. So this impervious treatment wasn't necessarily applied to the whole of these backyards. So I don't know the cost. We've had some preliminary discussions with WRA. Does have people who can conduct this. I think it's a matter of how readily is the data or information available from what was built and what's out there too. As was stated, if there are conditions out there that are somewhat different than what's built, then you maybe have to reevaluate that. But if the fact is that most of this is captured into the system, that may be, fairly readily. It's something we would have to kind of scope and identify what that cost is.
Yeah, so I might add that as a request for staff to see what the feasibility. I mean, while not a hydrologist myself, I think there were two core issues in my head. One is I think Mr. Wheaton and others claimed that runoff may even be negative if not mitigated because of the French drain and the reverse slope design. I mean, if that could be verified, I think that's very material. And secondly, approximately 100-foot length, on only the north side of a creek that's very long, and volume buildup is based on many, many other parts of the neighborhood. I'd be curious on just a rough percentage of what, any impervious surfaces would do to the overall volume rate in a high flood storm. I mean, I think we just want to know if this is going to contribute to flooding or erosion, and perhaps, if the developer post-fact, post-report did a negative slope that ran towards the street, there really isn't a runoff issue. I mean, these are lingering questions in my mind, and I don't know what depth of we did a flood report which covered the entire city of Larkspur for our storm drains. I'm thinking this is going to be a modest type of engineering report relative to that.
And I do think what might help inform the report is for the applicants. I mean, right now we have an application that we work with them on where the request was really to lift this restriction from the fenced yard areas entirely. But they've also cited, here are different features we would like. Although in saying that, they also said, and not the, this is not the universe of such features. This becomes the question of to what degree do we continue to sort of manage or have oversight into the specifics of these yard spaces. So I think if the intention is for the applicants to look at, okay, how do we apply some kind of development standard, maybe a particular development setback beyond the impervious surface, and building setback to 25 feet, but for that 50 feet, we reframe it as no primary structures and some kind of special development setback that identifies kind of the range of concepts of the range of structures and sizes and some sort of approach to drainage. We're still kind of in the process. We're still kind of developing a formula that manages this in ways we don't typically do. But, it may be if at least it helps the property owners get to what they're seeking. But that's going to take a study that kind of reflects what it is they want to do. I think some feedback on whether that's even, an interest of the council to try to approach what it is they're looking for. May help give them some action on how much they may be spending moving forward for this process.
Yeah, so Neil, I'm sorry, thank you, Mayor. As a follow-up, let me try to simplify my request. And I think what you're saying is there's an iteration between what they may want to build, like a tennis court versus a hot tub, and what hydrology might bring forth. So wouldn't it be possible to say, look, in the hydrology, we're asking 3 questions. If all 6 lots were completely impervious, what would the impact be? If they were 50% impervious, what would the impact be? If they were not, to be changed at all and had, pure ground with, soakage, what would that be? So I think we're going to have to interpolate, what the, different requests will be, based on hydrology. I just think we probably need some objective report to see if this affects the flow at all.
I just want to remind the council that the applicant bears a burden for this study, even though the city would command the study. So the scope of the study needs to be carefully crafted around the applicant's request, and expanding it too far beyond the applicant's request raises questions about whether the applicant should have to pay for the study, and I think becomes then a separate project of the city. So I'm not sure we can actually accomplish what you just said, Councilmember Paulson. I think we have to actually meet with a hydrologist or an analyst who does this type of work and discuss what's necessary to meet the need of the applicant's request. If then the council is not satisfied, the council can then decide if it wants to commission a much larger exercise. But I think that needs to, in fairness to the applicant, be a separate thing.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, and thank you, Dan, because you kind of expressed what I was going to say. There seem to be kind of two issues here that we're confronted with. One is there's a gap in the information that we have concerning particularly the hydrology as well as related water quality impacts. And I think consistent with what Dan you just said, I think staff needs to work with the applicant and make sure that there's an agreed upon strategy to address those data gaps. Secondly, though, I think there's also some questions about this issue of specificity that was raised by the Planning Commission and was reiterated in various comments tonight in terms of development standards. So my suggestion would be to encourage staff to go work with the applicant, the homeowners association, others as may be appropriate to figure out an appropriate strategy to meet the needs of this community going forward, and have that taken back to the Planning Commission for further review and assessment and determination before it comes back to this council. Vice Mayor Helmer.
One final observation, and Neil, please correct me if I'm wrong. As I understand it now, we're asking the Planning Commission to provide more specificity, and by that I mean after listening to the questions and comments tonight, my understanding is there's a discussion about how to define what's allowed, and by that I mean in this 25-foot zone behind the house. What are the side setbacks? 6, 8?
Typically 6, I believe.
Okay, so 6 feet on each side, 50-foot lots.
Yeah,
so
I think they're generally 50.
So that's 38 feet wide by 25-foot deep zone. How much of that should be allowed to be impervious? And there's one suggestion that 60% of that, if I understand comments earlier. And then you clarified that an accessory, like a pergola with a roof on it that could be as 15 feet high, if already covering a footprint as large as whatever's allowed at 60% or whatever, that would not count as additional impervious surface, that roof, because you already counted it in a footprint of sorts. So we would be allowing some area back there that then could have a roof on it that would not count against it as additional impervious surface. Is my understanding correct?
I think if your test was strictly impervious surface, you're correct.
But you said earlier, if I heard you correctly, that before a permit's triggered, it could be 15 feet high.
That's correct.
Okay.
If
so
for an
that's
accessory structure.
That's my takeaway, and that should be clarified with the Planning Commission. We're asking them to provide any further specificity on that envelope allowed, I guess.
Because I guess the question, what I'm trying to understand in your question is it directed towards that there's a relationship if we just focus on impervious surfaces where ignoring the potential impacts of the structures on top of those
Well,
surfaces.
I heard you say that you don't double count a footprint.
Not in terms of
if
runoff.
it's layered on top of each other.
Yeah, not in terms of runoff. If runoff is the whole issue, then you're right. You could have a certain amount of impervious surface, and that could be entirely structure or entirely surface area or some portion there, combination thereof. If your test is also the amount of pervious surfaces and treatments and some other limit on accessory structures,
but
because this setback is currently worded includes the term accessory and buildings, impervious surfaces and buildings. And a building is kind of like any sort of structure. So trying to get at what was really intended behind this setback limitation, there's some assumption that maybe it was also about not just the runoff and the surfaces, but the buildings that may be in these areas as well.
Are you saying that they'll have some sort of review of design?
Well, I interpreted the commission's statements to suggest that there should also be a limit on the size of accessory structures in these areas, or potentially the use, whether they're enclosed or habitable. They didn't say that in the motion, but that was somewhat in their discussion.
But I heard you say that it wouldn't be triggered unless it was over 15 feet high, but for a permit.
Well, that's the limit. That's the limit of height for an accessory structure. A permit could be triggered by anything over 120 square feet.
Okay.
It could be triggered for things requiring electrical permits or plumbing. Doesn't necessarily,
So a 20 by 25 foot pergola, 15 feet high, what would that require a permit?
Yes, because it's larger than 120 square feet, and the height of the structure would trigger.
But upon review, it still could be allowed.
But it might still be allowed because it meets the height limits and if it meets setbacks, etc.
Thank you.
So again, my suggestion would be, I mean, I don't think we're going to make a lot more progress here as a city council in dealing with these issues. I want to make sure that staff has sufficient direction from the conversation that we've had tonight. There are some open issues about insufficient information regarding hydrology. That may be something that can be addressed, at least in terms of scope, through conversations with the applicant and maybe the homeowners association to make sure that those data gaps are filled. And then to go back to the issue of potential design standards and making things a little bit more specific along the lines that the Planning Commission was suggesting would be something that also may be desirable to pursue. So my question, Neil and Dan, does staff have sufficient direction from this body to now go to the next step to work with the applicant and other interested parties and bring this back to the Planning Commission?
Well, I just want to say, Mr. Mayor, I thought it was very helpful to clarify.
Oh, yes.
Especially around the impervious surface understanding.
No, I agree. I agree completely.
I think I have sufficient instruction. Neil can say he does, but he's leaving. So,
well, and I want to make sure I'm giving the applicants have a sense of what their mission, where their efforts could end up. That, I think recognizing what they're looking for and then trying. It sounds like what the council is really looking to do is, given their request try to see how we can accommodate revising this setback in a way that can meet some of their wants and needs, but do it in a way that assures it's meeting the intent of the setback, particularly in terms of hydrology and runoff.
Right, and then have that teed up for the Planning Commission, which will have further public hearings and create an opportunity for other interested members of the public to express their views on what's being developed. That seems like a good plan. And you have two weeks to make that all happen. Or maybe a little more.
Set the table.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure quite.
I'll try to tee it up.
I think because I see the city attorney has unmuted himself, he might be recommending what a motion needs to be here, because we do need to continue the matter.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that that based on what I've heard, the basic motion would be to remand this application back to the Planning Commission for further consideration. But that additionally, what I think I've heard is for staff to develop some information to fill in the gaps that have been identified within the scope of what the applicants have applied for. Right. And also, as Neil said, to develop an alternative proposal that attempts to meet the goals of the applicants while also preserving the intent of the 25-foot setback that is, I probably misidentified the inside the fence setback as created in the precise development plan. Does that sound reasonable, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to preserve the intent in terms of protecting water quality and impacts to the creek and hydrology. It sounds to me that that's kind of the outstanding concern, is getting data, filling in those gaps to really determine if some change can be done to meet their goals without creating adverse impacts. And if it creates adverse impacts, then we've got to take it to a different level.
So Sky, can I just get clarification in terms of what your recommendation is? Is it simply, do we need a formal motion, or do we just?
Since this is a public hearing, I would suggest a formal motion. And that's why I was suggesting the remand back to the Planning Commission for further consideration. And then the direction that I've heard from council is for staff to develop further information to fill in the gaps that have been identified by the council within the scope of the application, and to work with the applicant on developing an alternative proposal to attempt to meet their goals, preserve the purposes for the setback at issue, and to take into account the Planning Commission's recommendations.
So the suggestion is that we make a motion simply to remand with direction to further proceed before the Planning Commission in light of the direction given by the council tonight.
I think that's adequate.
Okay, because I don't want to get it too specific, or else we'll be tying our hands.
Yeah.
So if someone would like to make a motion along those lines, I'd be happy to entertain it.
I will make that motion. I don't want to, whatever, yes, I make that motion.
Okay, is that sufficient for us to move forward?
Yes, I think that it's a motion on your statement.
Okay, good enough. And I think Councilmember Paulson has seconded that motion, so we can have a vote.
Councilmember Kandel,
Yes.
Councilmember Paulson,
Yes.
Councilmember Waive,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Homer,
Yes.
Mayor Haroff.
Yes. So the motion is approved, and that will conclude our consideration of item number 7.2 in the public hearing section of our agenda. We don't have any business items under agenda item number 8, and I think that brings us to 9, which is closed session, which will require us, I think, to adjourn our regular session of the council in order to go into closed session, and at the conclusion of the closed session, we'll come back into open session and report out any action as necessary.
And I'm sorry, before we do that, can I just ask, I know we've been at this for about 3 hours now, and the closed session may take a little bit of time. Would it be possible, I think coming up, we have a relatively short meeting with the passing of the baton. Would it be possible to continue this to either that meeting or another upcoming meeting with a little bit of a shorter agenda?
I'll defer to the city attorney.
I think we might have lost the city
I believe
manager.
the city manager left to start the closed session meeting, so I can call him back if you'll give me one moment.
Yeah.
Well, we're still within our 10:30 departure time, which is, we often have to go to 10:30. So,
okay, just
I mean,
throwing it out there.
we got another hour, but if we could take a bio break, that'd be great. And then,
Why don't we do that while Allison tracks down Dan? But if we can get this all wrapped up tonight, that would be good. So why don't we take a five-minute break, come back, and then we'll adjourn as necessary.
Okay.
We're on break.
Okay, so do.
Okay, are we back here? Or are we at the next meeting?
I think we have to formally adjourn. We
Be
need
here and then adjourn?
We need to have everybody back yet, though. Not everyone's back.
We did our speed version of the Hanukkah candles. That was fun. Zipped through it, got some presents out. I'm going to grab a little more water, I guess. I'll be right back.
Kevin, are you going to do the lighting at Bon Air? The tree lighting?
Yes. Yeah. I don't think we did it last year. We did it 2 years ago, and it was in pouring rain. So we won't have that problem this year.
Yeah.
I already left the room and went to the other rooms. What did I miss? I went to the other room.
No, we're still in the regular session.
Oh. I went to the other room. I was the only one there.
That's when you missed a vote earlier.
What did I miss? I went to the other.
I was going to text you. I was going to say, please, the future of Larkspur hinges on this vote. Where are
I texted Allison. I said, I'm in this other room. Where is everybody? She's like, no, we're still in the other one. So what did I miss?
So we're still waiting for Dan Helmer.
He's probably sitting in the other Zoom waiting room. That's a good thing, Dan, about having these young city clerks. They text you right back. It's fabulous. I was like, I texted Allison. I said, I'm lost. Where is everybody?
I think that means that she and I are old because my son doesn't text at all. He's on whatever else they use. Yeah.
So should we?
So are we going to close session or not? Or where did
I'm not sure. I got a message to come back. I went to open the closed session room. And then
a quick question, Dan? How much time? I mean, we do have roughly 60 minutes, and I think Scott's right. It's been a long day, but about how long do you think it would take to cover both agenda items?
Closed session.
I'm not comfortable talking a lot about that in open session, but that is kind of your call. So I think we need to be in closed session before we.
I say we go to closed session. I mean, that would be my vote. Let's just get started. And
I agree.
We can see what happens.
Okay. Do we need Dan Helmer to adjourn, or can we just go ahead and adjourn to go to closed session?
I think you're fine to adjourn the closed session.
So since we're still in regular session, we will adjourn the regular session for purposes of going into closed session. And when that is concluded, we'll come back into the regular session and conclude the meeting. So the regular meeting is for now adjourned.
Okay.
So I am now unmuted. So we are reconvening the regular session of the Larkspur City Council for today after having concluded the closed session with no reportable action as a result. So now that we're back in our regular session, I think the last item for the agenda is a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So moved, and I think we had a second, and absent any objection, the meeting is adjourned.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.